Welcome in everyone to GDT Live, and today we're joined by Mike Commito, the author of Hockey365, as well as a number of other books. And Mike's a hockey historian and an author, and just somebody that I really enjoy to follow on Twitter. And Mike, I got to ask you, every day I see your history tweets, your throwback tweets. What kind of
Yeah.
inspired you to do those?
I get, yeah, like this goes back I guess a long time ago now. Now that I think about this, when I was when I was in grad school, I was doing environmental history, so I was focused on a topic that is wildly different than hockey, and I think looking for a bit of a creative outlet that was a little bit more fun than maybe some of the drudgery of readings and research I was doing, and so I started, blogging about hockey history on my own, but it wasn't necessarily hockey history. It was like this combination where I was trying to mix Canadian history with hockey. And then this was just like
Yeah.
weird Frankenstein. And at the same time, I was noticing that there seemed to be an appetite for hockey history tidbits. And so like I had long time followed NHL history girl, Jen Conway, who'd been doing it for a number of years and did a really excellent job. And the thing that I noticed about Jen's stuff is she had great facts, but when I first started doing it, I noticed she didn't necessarily use a lot of media, whether it was like images or GIFs or videos. And so I thought she's doing a great job at sharing the history, but there might be an angle that I can come in at. And I started, cutting up my own GIFs. I started finding images that kind of try to encapsulate the moment. And then that's honestly how it started. I thought it would be a fun way for me to kind of take my love of history and then provide hopefully something a little bit different. And honestly, that's how it started. And then from there, the daily hockey history tidbits just kind of led to more writing opportunities, and the writing opportunities kind of took over. But obviously, the daily hockey history stuff is still there.
And when you're doing like the daily hockey history stuff, like how do you go about sourcing those types of things? Because I run the daily face-off social media, and I've been doing a post all summer where it's like, this day in hockey history, and sometimes it's hard to find stuff. And I've used some of your pieces as references. But for yourself, like how do you kind of go back and remember those dates and just remember what's kind of happened on those ones? Do you have like a big log or something like that?
So this is a little bit scary, but if X, and I think we've thought that X's demise was, many, like it's probably, been dead a few times now and it still continues to exist. But like, if that goes, then like, so does my database, right? Like it's all based on
Right.
what I've shared year over year. And I just kind of go through my account from that day through the archive and I just repost those every year. And so where I started though was, I had a link to a page that the Hockey Hall of Fame used to have, and it's just a text-only website that was actually shared to me by somebody who runs the St. Louis Blues history account, but then they blocked me for some reason. So I'm not sure why. I think they maybe thought that I was going to infringe on their territory by sharing any St. Louis Blues history. Apparently, you're not allowed to do that unless you're that account. But anyway, they were kind enough to share that resource with me and then block me. So I had used that because it was literally just you would plug in the dates at the top in your search bar, and then it would spit out everything that they had in their records from the formation of the league, 1917 up until I think the first lockout is when it ended. So I had a really good database that I was able to mine for a good chunk of the league's history. And then the NHL website also does a little history section. It's buried below in all the other links that they have, but that's a great place where I've had some information. Then honestly, like during years like the pandemic, I would honestly just do I would search NHL transactions 2010 to 2011, and then I would just search dates, and then I would get information from there, and then I would go into YouTube and I would put October 11th, and then see what came up that day. And I'd maybe find like a random highlight that I forgot about or, didn't realize it was on that day. And then I would kind of incorporate that. So it's like, it's always evolving and I'm always adding to it every time something new happens. I think today when we're talking, it's the anniversary of Quinn Hughes being named captain of the
Mm-hmm.
Vancouver Canucks, right? So there is always new stuff, but it's just like it's I think finding those sources and then mining those as best as you can, and then just adding it over time and taking stuff that I see on your socials or other people's socials and incorporating that into the next year. And people give me suggestions of like, why don't you have this today? And I'll add that. So it's like a living, breathing thing, right? Every year it evolves, but certainly,
Yeah.
hopefully, it will continue, in some form if X were to implode one day, which I think is, any day now, right? So.
It's inevitable, I think, at this rate for sure.
Mhm.
And yeah, and like on that subject too, like even today, like when I was doing some research for today's post, it was like, oh, the Hockey Hall of Fame was started today. So I was
Mhm.
like, oh, that's pretty cool. But I opted for the Quinn Hughes being a Canuck captain because it was just more recent, and I feel like more people online are just more into the recency stuff.
Yeah.
But I noticed that there are like if you follow the account Super Sports 70 or Super 70
Yeah.
Sports, like holy cow, do they get a great engagement and fans just love that type of stuff. Do you find you get more engagement on the older history tidbits or the newer stuff?
To be honest, it's all over the place. And I do think that obviously with the state of Twitter, X, whatever you want to call it these days, like
Yeah.
it's really hard to gauge like what gets interest now, just because like
Yes.
tweets I've had in the past that performed really well, like now I'm getting bagels on posts that otherwise like
Yeah.
should at least get some engagement, but they're obviously getting buried in the algorithm or whatever it may be. So I think there's people all over the place that love to see those obscure players. Like they love being reminded of a player that maybe they really liked for no other reason other than they were their favorite like third line grinder on a team, and they forgot all about that player. And then this post reminds them of that. But I do think that people love those old school pictures, and I think I follow that 70s sports account as well. And like I'll post
Yep.
a picture of Rogie Vachon in front of his Mercedes Benz outside the Great Western Forum. It'll get 5 likes, but then they'll post it, and they've got a way better way of presenting why this photo is cool, and it'll get a ton of engagement. So I think it's also the way that you present, those moments as well, and whether or not you've got a good visual or a good GIF or a good video. But it is truly all over the place. I think there are people in my group that I think love the old stuff as well, love the
Hmm.
obscure posts, love maybe some things about rule changes. Like you never know. And then I think certainly Quinn Hughes post does well today because the Hughes brothers are in the news again with obviously the
Yeah.
breaking news that these brothers would want to play together at some point in their careers. Who would have thought? But
Who?
yeah, like obviously everybody, but nevertheless it's been topical. You've been seeing the news cycles with the Hughes brothers, talking about their futures together potentially. So I think picking that post today makes a lot of sense because it just kind of ties into what people are talking about.
Absolutely. And that's it's funny that you mentioned Rogie Vachon because one of our podcast guys here, Dallas Vachon, that's his uncle.
Oh, really?
So
That's pretty
we
cool.
so yeah, it works out kind of well. A nice little family connection there. When you put together Hockey 365, and I've read that book and really enjoyed it, Mike.
Thanks.
How do you put together a book like that? Like how do you come together with all these moments and just put it together without forgetting certain things?
Well, I'd be lying if I'd say I didn't forget certain things. I think with the especially with the Hockey 365 books, because those are just general hockey history books, so it includes history from
Yeah.
across the league and across its history. So like the first book, I tried to do my best to pick what I believe to be historically significant moments for those days, but obviously my interpretation of what is significant that day will be different from what your interpretation of what might be the most significant moment of that day. So admittedly,
Sure.
I'm interpreting that, and that's my own personal opinion based on my own lived experience. But for that one, like it was easier, I think, to hit on like those key ones that I think people wanted to see. And then when I did the second book, I challenged myself to obviously not use any of the original stories from the first book. And so that forced you to kind of think about, well, I can't use Wayne Gretzky beating Gordie Howe's record on this day. I've got to find something else. And so that I think actually pushed me and allowed me to pick some more random things that may not have been like historically significant to the league or a team that day, but it's a funny moment or it's a lighthearted moment or it's a sweet moment that makes you remember why you love hockey. And so I think that is, I tried to do as best I could, knowing that like it's my interpretation. So it's going to resonate with some people, but it's not going to resonate with everybody. But I do think, and I do agree that there's times when I'm just being guided by, I know I've got a database of facts that we already talked about, where I know I can start to go through a list of calendar dates and say, I'll pick this. And you're kind of going through it because you want to fill up your spreadsheet so you have enough dates, but you're not necessarily keeping a track of, like, when I do Leafs 365, did I have enough Brian McCabe stories? Like, I'm not looking necessarily for a Brian McCabe story. I'm looking for things to fill up that date. And then as you put the book together, you're like, oh man, like I don't have enough Brian McCabe stories, or I didn't talk about Nazem Kadri as much as I wanted to. And it's not that there's not enough moments that I could have picked for either of those players. It's just there was something that day that I thought needed to be included, or, and it's just kind of this matrix you put together where ultimately you write the whole thing and then you start to see like how it takes shape. But I think by the time I got a little bit further along with some of these books, you start to realize there are key players that I'm going to want to make sure that I include. Are they represented enough in these stories? Is Bobby Orr, for example, is there too much Bobby Orr? I would say no, but you start to think, like, can I swap some of these out for other players who may have not had a chance to have a story feature? So it is tough. And I think certainly there'll be people that have read these books and say, like, how could you have not had this story in there? But I mean, I think that's just always an opportunity down the road to release another volume or some other content where we kind of address maybe something that I'd missed along the way.
Yeah, some of the forgotten ones or whatever, just do its own little book, right? Was there like a story that surprised you the most when you were putting that one together?
Which one?
The
The
Hockey
first one?
365. Yeah.
Well, I can't remember if that was. I think the second one might have been the one where I actually had one of those moments, because I don't think it was in the first one. Bear with me if I'm wrong, and it is the first one.
No,
But
no,
when I was doing one of the first two, there's this there's a Heritage Minute moment, or Heritage Minute, about Maurice Richard like going out and scoring 8 points. Like, I think it was 5 goals, 3 assists, 8 points, the day of moving his family across town to a new house or new home in Montreal. And as a kid, I grew up, believing this story because it was a Heritage Minute, and that was obviously a big deal if you're anyone of my vintage. Those were these like classic, corny, cheesy moments that kind of showcased, moments of Canadian history. Some of them may or may not be problematic now, but that one was kind of like this legend of Maurice Richard. He was an incredible hockey player. But so for him to have done that in a day, that seems like something Maurice Richard would have been able to do, because he was just larger than life. He was such an important, figure to the Montreal Canadiens, to the Francophone community in Canada, all that stuff. And then as I was doing the research, I came across some work that Dave Stubbs from NHL.com had done, where he'd gone back, he went through some French language newspapers, and he had found that in an interview that Maurice Richard did years later with a French language paper, the move had actually happened the day before. So if anyone's moved, that that's still a pretty, I think, significant feat, that the day after he still went out and scored 8 points, which was an NHL record it held for a number of years. So for me, it wasn't necessarily that made that moment any less special. It was just, even as a historian, in the year 2020, we're still learning about new things, and we're still finding out, different interpretations of events that we, perceive to happen a certain way. And it certainly doesn't take away from the lore of Maurice Richard, but that was surprising to me that, it's taken Dave doing that article originally, I think in 2017 or so, to really kind of, I think, correct the record, but ultimately just provide more nuance to what actually happened. It doesn't take away from what he did from a hockey history perspective, but I think it just kind of changes the way that we viewed that feat in the context of, he wasn't moving that day, but he was still probably pretty sore from lugging couches and fridges and all this stuff up and downstairs. So,
I mean,
still a hero move, but maybe just not exactly the way that we had thought.
one of those old wise tales that's kind of told and gets changed along the way a little
Yeah.
bit. What's
Yeah.
one of your favorite stories that you've kind of written about? Like, do you have a favorite one? I know that's probably a pretty loaded question considering all the books you've written, but is there maybe just from like the first or second editions, is there something that stands out?
I mean, to be quite honest, it's tough now because Bruins 365 will be number 5 in the series. So You
Yeah.
can probably do math quicker than I can in how many different moments I've had
Oh,
to do over the years. But I guess the ones that always stick out for me are the ones where, I get to kind of include, I think, a piece of myself in those stories, and not from like a
yeah.
selfish perspective because I need to include myself in everything, but because I think when I'm doing that, I'm envisioning somebody else thinking about that moment, and I was here when this happened. So I think one for me in the first two that always sticks out is, my first daughter Zoe was born at the end of September in 2016, and so the first Leafs game that we got to experience together was Auston Matthews' 4-goal debut. So,
Oh,
as a Leafs fan and somebody who's has tried for the last 9 years to get his daughter to be interested in the Maple Leafs and has not succeeded so far, to have her with me watching the game because she truthfully slept through the whole thing. I'm in a Leafs jersey. She has these Leafs pajamas that are too big for her because she was born a couple weeks too early, so everything's too big for her. But we're watching this game. I'm holding her. My wife's watching. My wife is not a huge hockey fan, but even she's like, "Is this normal? Like, should this be happening?" And I'm like, "Absolutely not. Like, this is truthfully historic. No one has ever scored 4 goals in the history of the NHL, and I think even before he hit that fourth goal, there had been people that had scored hat tricks before, but like for
yeah.
him to do what he was doing was truly incredible, right?" And so for me, I always think of that moment, obviously because it was an important moment for me as a new father, but because so many Leafs fans can remember I was with my friends at this place or I was with my dad at this bar and we watched the game and we were losing our minds watching this unfold. And then, of course, you have the Senators fans who will always be quick to remind you that, they lost in overtime because there's nothing that they like more than reminding Leaf fans how that game ended. But I think everyone can still kind of envision themselves where they were in those moments, whether it's, Matthews' 4-goal debut or any other moment in hockey history. I think we all have that personal connection to the sport. And so I think those are the stories that I like telling, tying them back to the actual, significance of the date. But I think when you can include yourself in the perspective, it allows, I think, the reader to also think and put themselves in that position and remind themselves at a moment in their life that maybe reminds them of somebody that, they haven't hung around with before, or, they're missing for other reasons. And I think that's just kind of the fun part about doing these books, and hopefully those connections that are made between the page and the reader is ultimately what I think what authors want to do, right? You want to
Yeah.
spark that connection and then have the page be more than just words.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a great way to put it too, because it's not selfish at all. I think when you're able to put yourself in those shoes and write that moment out, I think it adds that extra like level of like specialness, if that's even how I wanted to word it
Mhm.
that. But it adds that little extra flavor, and I think that that's super important because like whenever people talk about like Crosby's golden goal, I often like I just get it in a vision back to my living room, sitting with my sister and my mom and my dad and watching it when I was 14 years old.
Yeah.
So it's just those types of things. They always just, they're right there, especially when you can read them. It just flashes back to you, right?
Yeah, I know exactly. I was watching it in my with my buddies at one of my buddies' place, and I was supposed to be doing an afternoon shift at the Travelodge Hotel, and I didn't go in for my shift. I was probably like a good hour and a half late, and I showed up, and I think the manager on duty at the time was like, "You know that you're like significantly late for the shift. Like, what's your excuse?" I'm like, "The Canada." Like I had to watch these. Like that's fair. And then as I checked people in that day, like they were coming in from being on the road, and they're like, "How did the game go?" And I told them Canada won. We're high fiving each other. So like it was one of those moments where everyone remembers that for sure if they're of age where they can remember the golden goal. And everybody I think
Yeah.
has a unique story of like where they were, if they've missed shifts or whatever it was. But yeah, I did not get fired from the travel lodge, and that's that. Only in Canada could you use that as an excuse to be an hour and a half late for a shift and still not get reprimanded. So
Game on. Week 2 starts now, and every touchdown brings you closer to a payout with DraftKings Sportsbook, an official sports betting partner of the NFL. This isn't just football, it's first touchdown fireworks anytime TD rushes and live bets that ride every momentum shift. At DraftKings, every play is your next shot to win. This week's on DraftKings Sportsbook app, you can find lines such as the Buffalo Bills at minus 305 to beat the New York Jets and much more. Lines and odds are subject to change. New customers, this one's for you. Bet just $5 and get $300 in bonus bets instantly. Plus, grab over $200 off NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Your season starts now. Download the DraftKings Sportsbook app and use code THPN. That's code THPN to get $300 in bonus bets instantly when you place your first bet of $5 or more, plus over $200 off NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV in partnership with DraftKings. The crown is yours.
Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER. In New York, call 877-8-HOPE-NY or text HOPE-NY 467-369. In Connecticut, help is available for problem gambling. Call 888-789-7777 or visit ccpg.org. Please play responsibly. On behalf of Boot Hill Casino and Resort in Kansas, fees may apply in Illinois. 21 and over. Age and eligibility varies by jurisdiction. Void in Ontario. Bonus bets expire 7 days after issuance. See sportsbook.draftkings.com/promos. NFL Sunday Ticket offer for new subscribers only and auto renews until canceled. Digital games and commercial use excluded. Restrictions apply. Additional NFL Sunday Ticket terms at youtube.com/go/NFL Sunday Ticket/terms. Limited time offer.
Oh, absolutely. And just on that topic quickly, before we get on to something else here, we just had, I work for the Kamloops Blazers as well, and we just had their training camp wrap up. And some of the 2010 kids don't know about Crosby's goal. They were born after. And I was just like, holy smokes, like, how old am I? Like,
yeah, it makes me feel very old now for sure.
Yeah, it does. So when you're going about these books, and I kind of asked you about how you find the tidbits for your daily stuff that you do. I'm losing my words here. But when you're doing the books, you go through interviews, you go through archives. Is that kind of what you do to put them together?
Yeah, a lot of the stuff are a lot of the stories I've featured in some way or another, whether it's on Twitter or stories I've written for different outlets over the years. So I've got a pretty good grounding in a lot of those things. But yeah, I'm definitely going back.
Yeah.
I'm referring to like old newspaper coverage. I'm watching highlights to see what I can kind of glean from how it was talked about or what I could see myself from watching something. And because as we kind of shifted away from the general hockey history books and got team specific, the stories became shorter. So for Leafs, Habs, and Bruins 365, like the stories are shorter than the original 2 books. And so you don't necessarily need like a ton of research to write like 175 word story, right? It's roughly two quick paragraphs. So I don't necessarily do a lot of interviews either, although with Habs 365, I was fortunate enough to be connected with quite a few Habs alumni who I was more than happy to take telephone calls with, because you're not going to turn down an opportunity not to talk to Yvon Cornway. So I talked to him, for a half hour. I ended up using like 2 sentences that he said because I'm constrained with how much space I have. But those types of stories, I think when you get those firsthand perspectives, you're able to kind of, I think elevate and add something unique to a story, because if it was a conversation that I had with that person, then that's a different answer that I might have received, because maybe it was a question that wasn't asked quite the same way, or that question was asked 15, 20 years later, and now they give a different answer. And so when I can, I'll try to include those, but oftentimes, you're able to make use of, I think, the knowledge you have, the sources you're able to find. And then if you're putting your own spin on things as well, like you can quickly eat into those 175 words, pretty quickly. So, but that's essentially how it is. It's a mix of all different sorts of sources to try to pull those stories together.
Do you think hockey fans are becoming like more interested in history and kind of stuff like that?
I feel like hockey's always had a really good appetite for hockey history. I feel like the league has really done a good job at, I think, celebrating its history. I don't want to say better or more than other leagues, because quite frankly, I follow hockey the most of anything else, but I really do feel like there is a connection with the game's history that is important. I think we saw that with the centennial celebrations in 2017, the league's push to, digitize its records so that you can actually go on NHL.com and go to their records page. And there's so much information that's now available, at your fingertips. And I think the teams themselves have done a really good job at celebrating the history, whether it's honoring players, whether it's doing, throwback nights or whatever it may be. And so I think there is, that group, again, whether or not that continues to carry on with the next generation of fans, I think it's incumbent upon all of us who are kind of working in that space, or they're part of that space in some way or the other, is to share those stories and make them understand why, you may not have been around for Sidney Crosby's golden goal. And that's a really easy case to explain the significance of that and the significance of Sidney Crosby. But I think as a hockey historian and some of the stuff that I've tried to do with other roles I've had, at the OHL with the Sudbury Wolves, it's like, how do you connect different generations of fans who may not have known about Mike Foligno in the 70s, but as they grow up and they go to Wolves games in the early 2000s or the 90s, and then they bring their kids, and it's like, how do you connect those different eras? That's the role that we can all play to try to bridge that gap and put somebody like a Nick Suzuki into the context of what the Montreal Canadiens have done and why he's important and what he's doing in his era and why that's meaningful. And so I think if you're able to do that and do it in a way that I think is engaging and isn't condescending in any way, then I think that it's easy to do that, because I think people do, if you care enough to watch a sport like hockey, which is admittedly probably one of the most niche and weird sports in all the major league sports, you probably have people who are committed to the cause anyway. So they're not that far off from I think being a hockey historian themselves, or at least being interested in that content.
Yeah, absolutely. And like, even thinking on that, like, I read a story from you earlier today, just doing some research, and you talked to Ray Whitney over and did a piece with his double overtime goal for the San Jose Sharks back in '95, and like stuff like that is just like, it's cool to me, even because like I didn't know about that, and I get to learn about it, find out stuff about that. Are you kind of doing more with the NHL in that sense, or is it just more team based where you're kind of helping out with certain teams and doing some history tidbits?
Yeah, it's definitely been more team based for me. Like I had a really strong. I mean, I still have a really strong relationship with the LA Kings. So I started writing for the LA Kings quite regularly in 2018. I was doing a lot of content for them, mostly in the hockey history realm, and we did that for quite a few years. Obviously, the pandemic kind of upended the way I think a lot of freelancers were getting and doing work, and so with different changes to teams and different personnel being either furloughed or moved into different roles, budgets changing, it became harder and harder, I think, coming out of the pandemic to get freelancing deals and to provide content. So my work with the Kings, I still do some stuff from time to time, but it has trailed off significantly from where it was, from 2018 until 2021. But from there, using the 70 plus stories I wrote for the Kings in that time period, I've reached out to other teams, and I've done stories for the Canucks, the Flames, the Oilers, the Devils, the Sharks. And so I think it's just trying to find a team that is receptive to that type of content. And then ideally, hopefully that person that you found that connection with is still there when you have another idea, and they can kind of greenlight that. So I always just try to think of, what is coming up in the calendar year for a team, that's a notable anniversary. So with Ray Whitney, that was the 30th anniversary of that double overtime thriller. And obviously the Sharks are not a team that is in the playoffs. And so I figured that, playoff hockey history content is probably welcome at that time of the year when it's pretty, when the regular season is over for them, other than the draft coming up and other things happening throughout the summer with free agency. Content is not readily available because the team they've gone, they've left, they've done their locker room cleanouts and exit interviews and all that stuff. And so I think it's just trying to find the fit and finding an idea that makes sense, that you think would be marketable to a broader audience. And so I still do those stories when I can, but I think obviously, as you can probably attest to, it's much harder to get a lot of these stories, bought and sold in today's age, unless you're doing it as either a full-time or regular gig. But I'm always happy to try to find somebody to take my stories, and I appreciate teams like the Sharks who've allowed me to kind of keep writing some of these stories and bringing that to the fans that may not have known about the Wizard. And that was before he was the Wizard, which I think is the coolest part for me, is that we know him as one of the best playmakers of his era, but when he was in San Jose, he was not the Ray Whitney we know now. I mean, he obviously was, and you could see some of those flashes of brilliance, but he was not where he later cemented himself when he got to, to the Panthers, for example, and really kind of, took off.
Absolutely. And I think that's what was cool for me, was it was learning a bit about him before he kind of took off, exactly like how you mentioned there. Before we switch topics and I ask you a fun question, I want to ask you, junior hockey history. Now, doing that for Sudbury, I think that is super cool. And I'm a junior hockey, just like a nerd, as some would put it. And do you find do you enjoy doing that for Sudbury? Is it a little bit more fun than the NHL per se?
I think they're both like. I mean, to your point, I think it's like a completely different market, different set of fans.
Yeah.
So I think I enjoyed it. And again, it's another one where like because of different changes, to the world around us, like I don't do as much Sudbury Wolves content as I used to. But I
Yeah.
love doing it because like I live in Sudbury. This is the team that is most readily available to me. And a lot of these stories that I was able to do feature people who some of them still live here and they still have lives here. And so you're able to connect, I think, more immediately, with the fan base and with a group of people by doing local junior hockey content than if I'm
Yep.
writing a story about the Maple Leafs, where I know it's going to resonate with people around the world, but I don't really see the impact of that. And so for me, those ones are really fun though, because junior hockey, as you well know, is like you've got guys that come through and they may come through for a year, 2 years, 3 years, and then they're gone. And then a lot of them don't go on to the NHL. They often don't necessarily have long, fulsome pro careers. They still contribute to society in meaningful ways. And for me, that was always the cool part is this is a player who was, if you were a Sudbury Wolves fan in 2007, you thought that this player was going to be the best player in the world because you were 12 years old at the time and you thought that he was going to go to the NHL and you would follow him for the next 20 years. That didn't happen, but like in your mind, he was still larger than life. And so those stories are still cool because you remember those moments. They were formative for you. And then even if they didn't go on to have those professional careers, they still often did some really interesting things. And so I got to do some stories about Wolves players like Shandor Afonso, who went on to become an official in the NHL, right? So again, he had a great career with the Wolves. He was beloved here, and now he's still in the NHL, but as an official. And so I talked to him about his journey from, transitioning from playing into becoming to an official and doing things like that. So those stories were always a lot of fun. And even for me, who's grown up in Sudbury for the most part, I didn't grow up here and I wasn't alive when you had Rod Schutt and Mike Foligno and Ron Duguay and Randy Carlisle, running through teams in the 70s. And so to connect with some of those guys and hear their stories and then share those and have the fans who are still here and watch those games relive those moments was always pretty cool. And they always let me do some pretty fun stuff. And so I got to, I think, go a little bit outside maybe what other teams might allow me to do, just because I think they trusted me enough with the Sudbury content that we can do some things that might not have worked elsewhere, but they worked for the Wolves.
I always enjoyed it. I thought it was always cool stuff. And I think, I can even kind of agree with that too. Like, writing stuff with the Blazers has been a lot of fun, and I've been doing these alumni catch-ups with guys, and like tomorrow I'm going to be chatting with Tyson Nash. And I was born in 96, so I was born right after they did the 3 Memorial Cups, and so getting to talk to him will be just a treat, and hear about the stories that he's had to share. But even talking to a guy like Devin Dubnyk, I grew up going to games, and getting to talk to Dubnyk now, I was hard for me not to fanboy a little bit at least,
Yeah.
but it's cool nonetheless. And I think that hockey history side of it and being able to connect with fans from different generations is awesome. Uh, Mike, I'm going to ask you a loaded question, but I want to ask you this because I think it'd be fun. Let's say you're writing a book about the 2020s era of hockey. What's one moment that has to be a part of it?
Well, I mean, the bubble hockey, I think that's just such
Yep.
a like it was quite helpful in some of these other books where Dog Days of Summer, like what kind of content do you have for like August and September and now in some of these books, like depending on who the team was, you've got teams playing games, meaningful games in August and September if they're going as far as the Lightning and the Stars did in that first era or that first bubble hockey installment. So I mean, I think that for sure is something that I've done and taken advantage of in order to kind of like add more rich content. I think in otherwise what might have been a birthday entry in the book or a paper transaction. So I mean, bubble hockey, it's such a. I think that will definitely be something where the people that grew up or not grew up, but like the people that experienced that will know exactly what that term means. but then people who were not of age, to really understand what was going on in that moment will not necessarily know what that means. And I think that's one of those interesting things and sad things, I guess, in reality as we get older, that'll be a moment in time for us that a lot of people will not have a reference point for, because I think it's changed. When I think of bubble hockey, I used to think of the bubble hockey game that you would play with the rods, right?
Yes.
And now when you say bubble hockey, that is not the first thing I think of. Now have a new reference point, and maybe over time I'll forget about that and I'll remember the good old days of bubble hockey before we had a pandemic. But that's really shifted everything. And so
Matt Larkin of Daily Faceoff just did like a piece with John Cooper and members of the Lightning like last week, I think it was. And even reading that from like, because I don't think a lot of those players had really talked openly about what the bubble was like for them. And very interesting to hear like Stamkos kind of talk about it, Cooper talk about it, and just what life was like there and how different it was. Like we all saw it from an outside perspective, and inside it was just completely different world, right?
yeah, oh yeah, I can only imagine what that's like and how much different it is. And it's interesting. I think there'll be some good stories as we kind of move further away, from that period in time. Just how, I know that I think the bubble hockey and I think the lack of fans in the stands at some point will present an interesting case on like how these players were still able to kind of do their jobs without the atmosphere to kind of really fuel a lot of that. Because again, I think that really kind of strips away that all the crowd and all I think the energy you feed off of there is really important. But to be able to still go and play at that level and do what they did without all of that extra, I think, jolt, I think is probably more interesting and more, I think, a testament to the to the professional drive of these players than maybe we taken for granted all these years, right? Because again, I can't.
Yeah.
It's really hard to imagine that. I think of like I've got a project right now, and I had the chance to talk to Barclay Goodrow, and from going from him in 2019 with the Sharks to having that game that they had where they came all the way back in Game 7 against the Golden Knights and ended up winning off that series of power play goals. That's his 2019 playoff run, and then the next year he's in Tampa, and he's got no fans. He's in the bubble. The next year they have some fans, but obviously still bizarre. But to go from those two moments of you've got full crowd behind you as you rally behind in this Game 7 contest to try to rally back and win, and then your next 2 years look vastly different from what that moment was for you in 2019.
Oh, that'll be a good little project. I'm looking forward to that just based off the little sample you just gave. Mike, if you could sit down with one player, coach, executive, anybody like that from history, who would it be?
Ooh, that's a tough question. Yeah, I mean, I had the chance to interview Wayne Gretzky in 2019, which probably would have been my answer at the time. That was a telephone call, though, so I think certainly being able to sit with these players in person, ultimately I think would be the best way to experience it. But one player I've always wanted to talk to, I think, was Daryl Sittler. As a Leafs fan, I never got to experience, what he did on the ice because I wasn't alive. But I think being able to talk to him in person, to hear his stories, to hear about, his time with the Maple Leafs, the highs and certainly the lows, dealing with Harold Ballard and Punch Imlach as his coach. He's got a lot of stories, I think, especially seeing, what he went through with Salming, in his battle with ALS. You could just see when when Boré came to Toronto, you could see how touched and moved, Daryl was. And I think a testament to the friendship they've had and the friendship they still continue to have up until Boré passed away. And so I think he's somebody where, for me, he always looms large, like in Leafs history. It's just like, he seems like such a stand-up class act that, I'd want to talk to him. But the list could go on. And again, admittedly, I probably have a better answer if I had thought about it, because I'm sure there are players I've wanted to get on the phone over the years and I just haven't been able to. But I would say like a player like that, a player like Sittler, while he's still around and is still, I think, able to share his stories, would be somebody I definitely would like to chat with.
Great answer. Mike, what's you just alluded a little bit to what's going on with Barclay Goodrow, but what's next for you? We got another book in the works here?
I do have something in the works. I can't share it just
That's
yet,
okay.
but it's coming. So you'll have to bear with me. But what I can say is that as we're talking, Bruins 365 is not officially out yet. So that is definitely what's next. That book comes out October 21st. So, once that book hits bookshelves, like that'll be my focus for the next little while, is obviously trying to get as many Bruins fans to hopefully get that book into their hands or into their Christmas stockings or under the tree in the next couple of months. So yeah, I would just say that that's kind of where my focus is right now.
Awesome. Hey, Mike, thanks so much for joining me today. It was a pleasure to chat with you.
My pleasure, Colton. Thanks for having me.
What's going on, everyone? Thank you for tuning into another video over here on the Game Day Tarps podcast and the Hockey Podcast Network. We've got so much more where this came from, so smash the like button, subscribe, and don't forget to hit the bell, turn the notifications on so you never miss a beat. For myself and the rest of the guys over at Game Day Tarps, we thank you, and we'll see you next time.